Today, we're going to talk about the origin story of America's two-party system. And, well, it starts in a place you probably wouldn't expect, with just one.
I mean, it feels like it's always been a permanent feature of American life, right? This constant battle between two major sides. But it wasn't always this way. Okay, so let's get into this.
That's right. For a short, kinda weird time, after the country's first big political fights, one party just so completely took over the whole landscape that its competition, well, it just sort of vanished. It left America with this single massive political tent where all the arguments were happening inside.
And this period, this experiment in having a unified government, is where our story really kicks off. And as you're about to see, it just couldn't last.
So right after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party, the party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, had basically collapsed. This kicked off what they called the Era of Good Feelings under President James Monroe. Suddenly, the Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson, were the only game in town.
Now, to really get what's about to happen, you have to understand what these early parties were all about. The Federalists, they wanted a really strong central government, a national bank, all to boost business and commerce. But the Democratic Republicans, they had this vision of a nation of formers with a much more limited federal government. So with the Federalists gone, these two totally opposite ideas were now stuck living together, fighting it out inside the exact same party.
And that is the key. That name, Era of Good Feelings, it was, let's just say, pretty misleading. Because even though there wasn't an opposition party to fight with, the country was quietly starting to tear itself apart from the inside.
And these weren't small disagreements. We're talking about huge divides. The North was industrializing, and it wanted high taxes, tariffs, to protect its new factories. The South, which lived on exporting cotton, absolutely hated those taxes. You had these fierce debates over a national bank, over who should pay for roads and canals. And of course, looming over every single conversation was the explosive issue of slavery, which was only getting bigger and bigger as the cotton industry boomed.
And all that westward expansion was just pouring gasoline on the fire. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase had nearly doubled the size of the country. That's over 800,000 square miles of new land. And every single new acre forced the same questions. Is this going to be a free state or a slave state? Is its economy going to look like the North, or is it going to look like the South? These divisions weren't just ideas anymore. They were lines on a map, and they were getting wider with every push west. So all of this tension, just bubbling right below the surface, it finally just boils over in the presidential election of 1824. This is the moment. This is the election that completely shattered the one-party system for good.
And this is where you can really see just how broken that party had become. There wasn't one single nominee. Nope. Instead, you have four major political figures, all of them calling themselves Democratic Republicans, running for president. Each one was basically the champion of a different, competing region of the exact same party.
So who was in the running? You had Andrew Jackson, the famous war hero who was super popular out west and in the South. You had John Quincy Adams, a president's son, and he was the favorite up in the industrial Northeast. Then there was William Crawford, representing the old-school Southern plantation owners. And finally, you had Henry Clay, the really powerful Speaker of the House, who was pushing his American system of tariffs and infrastructure, ideas that some parts of the country loved and other parts, well, they despised. It was basically a four-way brawl inside one big family.
So the votes are counted, and as you can see, Andrew Jackson wins the most popular votes. He also gets the most electoral votes, but, and this is so important, he didn't win an outright majority in the Electoral College. And the Constitution is very clear about this. If that happens, the decision goes to the House of Representatives.
And this is where the whole thing just goes completely off the rails. Henry Clay, who came in fourth and was knocked out of the race, just so happened to be the Speaker of the House. He threw all his support behind John Quincy Adams. So, Adams wins. And then, just a few days later, President Adams nominates, you guessed it, Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters were furious. They started screaming that a corrupt bargain had just stolen the presidency.
And that accusation, that corrupt bargain, it was the final blow. It was the moment the Democratic-Republican Party split apart for good, giving birth to the two-party system that we basically still recognize today.
So this was a formal breakup. You start with one huge party running everything, then the 1824 election just shatters it into these warring factions. Out of that mess, the outraged supporters of Andrew Jackson create what we now know as the Democratic Party.
And on the other side, the supporters of Adams and Clay formed the National Republicans, who would eventually become the Whigs. And boom, just like that, one party became two.
But here's what's so fascinating. Neither side thought they were creating something new. The Jacksonian Democrats were absolutely convinced they were the true heirs to Jefferson's vision of a government for the common man. But the National Republicans argued that no, they were the ones actually carrying on the legacy by promoting national unity and growth. Both parties were born from the same parent, and each one claimed to be the rightful heir.
So the era of good feelings ends in one of the nastiest, most bitter elections in American history. And what came out of it was a political structure that has turned out to be incredibly long-lasting.
When you get right down to it, the two-party system wasn't part of some grand plan. In fact, a lot of the founding fathers were terrified of political parties. Instead, this system was forged in the fire of those deep national divisions. It just sort of grew on its own as a way to manage these huge conflicts over money, power, and slavery that were literally splitting the nation apart. The parties became containers for these powerful, competing visions of what America should be.
And that kind of brings us to today, doesn't it? This whole story shows us that political parties aren't set in stone. They're built and then rebuilt by the biggest fights of their time. So it leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. What are the divisions of our own era that might just be powerful enough to break and remake the system all over again?